Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, I want to explore the Good Samaritan today and why he helps and others don't. Ultimately, I want us to think through some of the reasons why maybe we pass by those in need ourselves. One of the reasons may offer insight into our own decision-making process, and it could offer some insight into the choices others make that we find so frustrating. But to begin, this parable has certainly stuck in the social consciousness as much as really any parable or story Jesus ever told. The term Good Samaritan is understood even by those who have never heard the story itself. It's been written into laws offering legal protections for people who act as Good Samaritans to help strangers in need. The basic concept is one that people understand. Help those in need, help a stranger, and those are certainly good takeaways from this story. The story itself is a bit more involved, though, and has more complex meaning. I'll cover that today, at least in part, but as a way to start, I want to share some background information. It's true that there was tension between Jews and Samaritans in Jesus' time, but it was kind of a complicated relationship. There's actually recent historical study and scholarship that suggests that the tension was not as significant as it's often been thought. Whereas historians like Josephus painted a hostile relationship, other first century sources suggest Samaritans were still considered part of Israel and as part of the old northern kingdom of Israel. But Jews and Samaritans were differentiated by where they lived and by some of their specific beliefs. We know that Jesus has a long, drawn-out conversation with a Samaritan woman by a well in John's Gospel, and we get some idea of the different beliefs between Jews and Samaritans. An important element related to the location of worship, their holiest sites, but in reality, the differences were pretty minimal, especially from an outside perspective. So much was shared between them, including the Torah as scripture. And, I think as is sometimes the case, you find the most disagreement with the people you're closest with. So it's probably best to note the tension and differences without portraying Samaritans and Jews as all-out adversaries. In addition to the Samaritan in the story, we have a priest and Levite that appear, both Jewish. Both had duties in and around the temple. And of all people, they would have known the teachings of the Torah, which included a lot about caring for the stranger. And so that brings us to the outcome of the story. The priest and Levite, who are of the same group as the man left for dead on the side of the road, pass by him. It's the Samaritan who is part of another group who helps him. The man at the start of the story asked Jesus, "So who is my neighbor?" It's the priest and Levite who would be considered neighbors in the sense of belonging to the same religious sect and had the same history and living in the same area. But of course, Jesus helps him see that a neighbor is broader than just that definition. A stranger is a neighbor. Someone from outside your religious sect and your area is your neighbor still. Jesus was building a movement that looked beyond just the local provincial interests of Israel. And that began with the group or sect that was most similar to them, Samaritans. Learning to see Samaritans as neighbors represented a kind of baby step forward. It shouldn't be hard, but as we know from the story, it is. The dividing line seems real. Two pass by. Only one stops and helps, and it's the Samaritan who understands the teachings of the Torah best and treats the man left for dead as a neighbor. So why does the Samaritan help? Why do the others not help? The religious dividing line does seem to be a factor. There were some ethnic differences. The Samaritans were descendants of the northern kingdom of Israel, the tribes up north, which had been invaded over time. There's some historical debate, but at least some Samaritans likely blended in with Gentiles over time, more so than those who lived down south. And as a result, perhaps some, like the priests and Levites, saw Samaritans as ritually unclean and to be avoided. Samaritan towns and areas would have also been avoided by them as well. For the priest and Levite, following strict practices to remain ritually clean would have been important to them. Christians, under the guidance of Paul and other apostles like Peter, chose not to follow some of those ritual purity laws any longer. But whether we're aware of it or not, many of us usually develop our own standards of what's okay and what's not okay, and that may follow a particular belief system that we hold, or it might just be our personal values or set of judgments that we carry around with us, acknowledged or not. We all have an approach to living. The challenge for each of us is to consider whether the way that we've adopted truly makes sense and is best. Jesus' teachings point us to a different way of living that is characterized by care and compassion above all. That's really challenging to do now more than ever, to really love all. We're connected to every neighbor in the world with modern communication. Our neighbors are the victims and residents of Highland Park whose lives were torn apart on July 4th. Our neighbors are Ukrainians still facing war. And the countless stories of other people we see in the news on any given day facing hardship, discrimination, hunger, and every kind of need. It's possible when we see so much that we can begin to experience compassion fatigue. Maybe you find it difficult to fully care at times. Maintaining a sense of care for the world and one another requires intentionality and ongoing reflection. It also means caring for our own well-being so we have the capacity to continue to care. So why does the Samaritan help? Why is he the one who cares? Is it possible he feels liberated from concerns about remaining ritually pure? That's one potential answer. Maybe there's something about his own feeling of being vulnerable and out of place near Jerusalem as a Samaritan that he's moved to compassion and empathy for this man along the side of the road. That's a little bit more conjecture, I suppose. But as we make choices about how to live, we face all kinds of ethical dilemmas, similar to the priest and the Levite and that Samaritan faced on that road. If you see an ad asking you to give money to help starving children, what do? Are you obligated as a Christian to give to that specific request? You may have a variety of thoughts that go through your mind. Is it a trustworthy organization that is asking for the money? Do you have a specific percent of your income that you set aside for giving? Is that money already spoken for? Do you go above and beyond that if you're moved by this invitation? Of course, if it's a need that requires not just money, but your time and energy, well, the questions become a little more complicated yet. The truth is that in our modern society, with ongoing needs we see every day, we do pass by people. Let's get beyond any pretense about that. We're all that priest and Levite, in a sense. It's unavoidable. Most of us have an ethical system we use to help make these choices about maybe who we help and who we don't, whether we realize that or not. And there are 4 common approaches to ethics. Think of an issue you care a lot about and listen to these 4 approaches to ethics and see which one sounds more like you and your approach, or which ones seem to prevail when it comes to issues in our day, like maybe gun control, or abortion, or racial justice, or care for those in poverty, and any other number of issues. So the first of these approaches, you can decide by identifying a universal principle that you're devoted to. If you make decisions this way, you often have one primary principle that governs your decision-making, which you regard as morally right. You may stress the importance of following your conscience, and doing so even if it leads to fallout. Not all who use this approach share the same single issue or principle. People with this approach have a very clear-cut, no-nonsense way of deciding things. A given principle is always right, no matter what. Does that sound like the way you approach some things? Maybe you're more like the second approach, which is to decide with the end result in mind. If you make decisions this way, you have a strong sense of what the end goal and purpose is. You may have a set of values or principles that reflect that ultimate purpose. You spend more time than most evaluating advantages and drawbacks of a particular action to accomplish the greatest balance of good in the end. People like this have a clear sense of what the ultimate choice and end goal should be, but may see the how as a more complex matter. Does it sound a little bit like you? How about the third? You can decide case by case. If you make decisions this way, you don't tend to rely on any overarching principles to guide your ethical decisions, but you approach each situation as unique, requiring its own solution. You might have some rules of thumb, but you generally rely on intuition, insights you receive in the moment, or a personal evaluation of what effects your action will have, either for yourself or for the overall good. Being moved in a particular way might describe someone like this. Finally, you could decide based just on character. What do I mean? If you make decisions this way, you often have a set of disciplines or virtues that you seek to live by. You not only consider these virtues to be good in and of themselves, but by practicing them, you believe you just become a better person. You live in a certain way to build character in yourself and others. People like this may be less interested than others in talking about the specific right choices and more interested in just living and embodying certain principles that they value within themselves. So those are 4 common ethical systems and approaches. They're a quick and simple description of deontology, teleology, situation ethics, and character ethics. It might be hard to process all of that at once, and I certainly didn't go into great depth on any of those. You might identify with more than one of those even. But I share these because as we think about the decisions of the priest and Levite, it's very possible they were using a different ethical system to decide what to do. This is a parable. No one can say for sure which system a figurative character in a brief story represented. But for the sake of argument, if they were driven by more of a character ethics approach, rooted in the value of personal discipline and right living, then you can see some of the pros and cons of that. People today even maintain very strong discipline, for example, around certain practices and values as well, related to what they eat, how often they exercise, what things they avoid. It might relate to what risks they're willing to expose themselves to. And there can be a lot of internal logic to that. There can be a lot of good that comes from values like personal discipline, for example. Discipline certainly builds character, but if it becomes too rigid, you can see how that might prevent you from doing the right thing in a given moment that doesn't fit into your normal patterns and practices, like abandoning that discipline to help someone in need. You're forced to make a choice. Do you stick with what your normal values are, or do you make an exception and toss it out? For some, there is a universal principle they follow. That first approach I described, it might be a commitment to affirming life, to fairness and equity, to mercy. It could be many things. Often these are good things at their core. You decide you're all in on it. But like anything, if you push the idea too far, you always run into difficult and even negative consequences. When you elevate a principle or idea above people, it has consequences. As an example, ethicists are struggling with how we will teach artificial intelligence how to make ethical decisions, because just feeding one rule or even countless rules to an AI will backfire. There are always exceptions and cases where the rule that we want to live by will actually produce the reverse of what we want. As humans, we sometimes factor this in. We embody very complicated processes sometimes for making decisions. And I say sometimes we don't. There is danger in taking any ideology or set of principles to an extreme. We have ongoing wars and human misery and oppression throughout history to prove that. So you get the point. How we proceed with care and show compassion can be complicated. And when we get frustrated with other people's actions and decisions, sometimes we may disagree not only on the end result, but we may not even be using the same ethical frameworks and processes for making decisions. It's like speaking different languages. It's helpful to know what our decision-making process is and to also be aware of not just the upside of that, but the potential drawbacks of our approach as well, the blind sides. Obviously, at the heart of any situation, we may not help simply because of the perceived time, money, energy, or risk involved. In short, it may simply be too uncomfortable for us throughout all of this ethical stuff. Any ethical system will break down if self-preservation is our main guide. It's easy to demonize the priest and Levite in the story and question their motives and judgment, to see them as uncaring. And it's understandable. Jesus isn't holding them up as the ideal or standard in the story, and it's a shock because they would have been viewed favorably by those Jesus was speaking to. But we don't have to make them out to be villains either to appreciate this story. They've adopted a specific way of life that has some value and internal logic to it. But Jesus is pointing out where that approach breaks down. And there are times when we cling to a specific way of living or doing things that also breaks down and comes at the expense of our neighbors. Will we continue to cling to that or see the humanity of the one on the side of the road? What is Jesus asking of us? To hold to our principles or to hold the man beaten? Have we been the one on the side of the road ourselves, passed by for help because of the more rigid approaches of our neighbors or the institutions that we deal with? Has anyone ever been the Good Samaritan to you, looking past distinctions, past the effort or risk that was involved? God's grace breaks through all of that in the end and offers care and compassion to you wherever you are, whatever your situation. Jesus has taught us what it looks like to proceed with care for our neighbors. It's a vision and way of life we need more than ever. Let's make it so. Thanks be to God. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.